All right. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily Martin. I'm a monitoring specialist with the Water Quality and Monitoring Unit at ODF, and I will be running our compliance monitoring program committee meeting today. So first off, just a rundown of what will be covered today. First off, I'm going to be giving some riparian pilot study updates. Then I'm going to be talking about a compliance monitoring program ferns notice that we've got finished in between these meetings. And then Mount Hood Environmentals, Mark Rose will be presenting the roads and steep slopes overview. Mark Tepley from MHE is also here today to help with questions and support. And then I will be going over the next steps for the meeting after this one. All right, so just to get you guys an idea of where we're at with our riparian pilot study, we have already selected our sites. We've developed our outreach materials. In a previous meeting, we talked through the landowner access plan, and we've been taking those steps. We've contacted our stewardship foresters, and we're in the process of contacting landowners. So this is kind of a recap of our landowner access plan. First off, what we did is we contacted stewardship foresters, emailed them, did a follow-up call, and some of them actually gave us the landowner responses. They were really helpful. So they facilitated it with especially those people that maybe are more going to be more responsive to their stewardship foresters than people they don't know. So that has been going really well. And then for the stewardship foresters gave us a go ahead, and we did an initial contact with landowners telling them we were going to send them a packet. That first packet via letter form was sent after the phone call, and this week we've been sending out that second letter. About 10 days after that second letter, we'll be doing a final follow-up call, and hopefully by taking this approach, we'll be able to get a pretty high response rate. We've already gotten, I think, 20 something yeses, so it's going really well. All right, so our next step is going to be preparing our site packets and scheduling our data collection, and that will take place in August. So, I mean, pretty soon here. So our site packets, for those of you who are curious what that all consists of, oh, sorry, I think my share just went away. Let me just bring that back up. I don't know what happened. That's fun. Okay.
We were still seeing it.
Oh, you're still seeing it. Okay, that's really odd because it's not showing it anymore for me. So I'm gonna just go
It looks
ahead.
good there.
See,
That looks good.
I can't see it at all. So not sure what's going on. I've never had that happen. Okay.
Computer gremlin.
Yeah. All right. Well, can you guys see the regular slideshow right now? Because I
Those are
was doing,
your notes.
yeah,
If we can see
it's,
the slide. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, good. Because for some reason, I'm just gonna have to do it from in the app because it just went away for me. So I'm gonna get back to where I was. I've never had that happen, so that's cool. All right. Anyway, so our site packets consist of maps, which will help us with navigating onto and within the sites, and just with taking our data collection, looking at our specific points. And then it'll consist of the permissions, any intel from the landowner or stewardship forester that helps us, again, with site navigation and just access. And then our data sheets, and then our methods just for reference. We also, again, will be scheduling our data collection, which consists of things like procuring keys where needed, scheduling for teams, determining like what vehicles are needed, other travel logistics, contacting the landowner if they requested that they want contact before access, and then always contacting our stewardship foresters beforehand just so that they know where we're at. And if they want to come along, they can. All right. And then finally, after all of that prep, we will be doing our data collection in September through January. And I've been working on putting it together a schedule for that. All right. Any questions on our riparian pilot study before we move on? All right. Well, I'm not hearing any, so we'll keep on going. Let me know if you change your minds. All right. So now I just want to cover a little bit about a Ferns notice that I worked with Joe Touchstone on to complete. So when landowners are sending in their Ferns notification, there's multiple notices on the form that they get, and now there will be one for compliance monitoring just to help landowners get used to the fact that now there is a rule change where landowners are required to provide access to their operation sites for ODF compliance monitoring studies. And so now that's going to be actually at the top of that notice list. So hopefully that'll kind of oil the gears so that they are aware of that change before our next studies are planned. Any questions about that one?
There's a question is there in that notice a timeline for allowing that permission, that access?
No, there isn't. There isn't a timeline in the rules either. So it's just referring them to that rule. This is exactly what the notice says because the notices are all pretty short.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Well, moving on to Mount Hood Environmental, I'll have Mark Rose take it away. They'll be presenting on pilot study design and protocols for our roads rules and steep slopes rules upcoming studies here. So I'll just stop sharing.
Thanks, Emily. Mark Rose here, Senior Statistician with Mount Hood Environmental. I'm joined by Mark Tepley, Senior Scientist at Mount Hood Environmental. And as she mentioned, we're providing an update on the roads and steep slopes pilot studies here today. So first, just a little overview about the presentation. So first, I'll go through some context for the monitoring program. A lot of that might be review for the folks that are here today, but I think it's important to provide that lens and that perspective. Then the purpose and scope of these pilot studies, the rule selection process that we went through to select the rules that will be assessed during the pilot studies. Then a little bit about the roads pilot study approach, both the study design and the field methods. Same thing for the steep slopes pilot, and then as well as some anticipated outcomes. So starting with a little background context, as I said, this might be review for everybody on the meeting, but it's important because it was the lens in which we developed this study. You know, these points that I'm going to walk us through are things that we were constantly thinking about, anywhere from the rule selection to the way in which the data is collected, to how it's analyzed afterwards. So as you all know, Division 678 passed in 2022, now effective as of 2024. Directs the compliance monitoring program, and with a specific purpose stated, to analyze rule level compliance, report those findings to the Board of Forestry, legislature, federal groups under an approved HCP, with the intent to provide information that will allow for improvement in compliance through all these reasons: training, guidance, clarification, targeted enforcement, and increased public trust in FPA rule implementation. So, as I mentioned, the purpose of these studies and the way that they are shaped is intended to fulfill both the purpose and the intent here. So a couple more points on that Division 678 elements. So there's quite a few elements that direct how the compliance monitoring program should be conducted, and some of them are particularly relevant to study design and statistics. And those that are particularly important, I'm listing out here. So when reporting results for compliance rates, the Division 678 directs that there is a high level of statistical confidence. So we want to meet a high bar here, both in what is reported as well as, like, say, our uncertainty, like confidence intervals surrounding those. So we want that to all be rock solid. And the program to be informed by previous program assessments. So that kind of gets into why we're doing pilots. A couple years from now, these pilots will be considered previous program assessments, and be used to, inform how the compliance monitoring program goes forward. And then some more stats things. So explicitly defining all the sampling elements, like what's your population, what rules are being looked at, what is our research question here. Then looking at data at the appropriate temporal and spatial scales to reduce, potential issues like autocorrelation, variance, and bias. And then a couple things that Emily has mentioned. So now we have a known population size with these new OARs due to the activity completion notifications that are required. And finally, access is provided for activities such as monitoring after. So going forward to these pilot studies, once again referring to that Division 678, it calls out specific rule group priorities. First, we have Division 643, which is water protection, vegetational along streams. So that's the riparian pilot study that Emily mentioned and provided an update on. On the right, we just have a simple diagram of, the field approach. So that's the first one, and that's the first pilot study. Then there's two other rule group priorities that are called out in Division 678. That's road construction and maintenance. So that's the road pilot study we're talking about today. And then 630, harvest on steep slopes, the other pilot study we're talking about today. So that should create a pretty clear through line in how we ended up to where we are today, following that directive from 678. So what is the purpose and scope of these pilot studies? The main purpose here is to support the development and establishment of long-term compliance monitoring that is in line with, everyone can say it with me, I'm sure by now, Division 678. So here we'll be gathering data on priority rules that have been identified through that decision-making process, and rule groups with desktop and field assessments so that we can identify rules for compliance monitoring, understanding how frequently certain rules are applied, as well as how things are actually being implemented on the landscape. More purpose of the pilots is to test and evaluate field methodologies, optimize sample sizes and field protocols. So these tie directly into those statistical needs that are directed for the program. Identifying challenges and solutions, just like testing and evaluating field methodology. We all know when you go in the field, there are speed bumps, things can go wrong. We want to make sure to get ahead of that and understand, hey, if there's an issue like, let's say, accessibility on steep slopes, then we know how to deal with it beforehand so that we're certain to get the most solid, robust data without bias, so that when we're reporting compliance, we understand how that data was collected and that we can stand behind it statistically. And then finally, that the program can be adaptable to ongoing developments and program priorities, such as changes in spatial data, modeling that can inform application and implementation of these rules, say the slopes model or stream classifications or anything like that. We want the program to be able to adapt to changes to those, as well as changes to FERD's processes. All right, so that's what was inside the scope. What's outside the scope? Because that's just as important. These are pilots, so we're not looking to determine or report compliance. We're looking to get a lot of information here to accurately direct compliance monitoring, both in the rules, the methods, all of those things to meet that bar set by Division 678. We're also not looking at rule group level, not compliance with all rules for roads, but rather specific rules and clauses within those rules. We're not looking to evaluate desired future conditions or effectiveness, which kind of go hand in hand. Instead, we're looking directly at what is the language of the rule, does it apply, and if it applies, how is the field implementation relative to the criteria laid out in the rule. All right, so why am I here talking to you today? Again, well, Division 678 directs that external statistical support is used to support ODF and the team here to develop the program. So we've been developing study designs and field protocols for the riparian pilot study, and as well as these current pilot studies, the roads and steep slopes. And during that development, we've provided recommendations for the scope of the study, the rules that are evaluated, the process of the sample draw, study design, field approach, the data that's collected, and then the way that that data might be analyzed in the future. And throughout this process, we've been corresponding with the ODF team here today to ensure that all of our recommendations are, one, feasible and realistic, and two, that they align with the priorities of the program. Okay, getting into the rule selection, candidate rules, which I know you're all familiar with because there's been multiple rounds of review for these rules. So MHE, we reviewed the candidate rules that you all identified as priorities during the rule selection process for Division 625 and 630 roads and steep slopes. As I mentioned, there was multiple rounds of review. On your end, on our end, we wanted to make sure that the rules we're looking at are priorities and reasonable to look at. So our criteria when we were doing these rules, the main ones were that, well, the rule criteria has to be observable and measurable. And that the rule application can be assessed. So either with desktop review or a single field survey event. So you can measure it, observe it, either say on the written plan or through spatial data or out in the field, or a combination thereof, often a combination thereof. And that, yeah, as I mentioned, it's a combination of these three different ways to examine the rules. And then I have some more criteria. One is that the implementation is resistant to seasonal conditions. So, a compliance evaluation would not be dependent on, did it rain last week? That's not reasonable. That's not statistically defensible, anything like that. Two, that rule applications can be targeted. So we know beforehand what rules we'll be looking at. You don't select a harvest unit or a unit where a road was constructed and go look for a water crossing. Instead, that you can target the water crossings, a priori, and then go out there in the field and survey it. So there's that eliminates a potential source of bias there. that field evaluation does not require qualified expertise like an engineer or a geologist. You don't want to have folks out there doing all sorts of modeling and requiring this extremely high bar to understand compliance. That the rule applies across a range of Oregon forest lands. We want to be looking at rules that that are frequently applied, so we can cast a wide net rather than something that might be rare and infrequent. And finally, that this data is reasonably efficient to collect. Moving ahead to the roads pilot study. So I'll walk through a bit of the roads pilot study, then we'll walk through steep slopes, and then I'll wrap up here. So first, the roads pilot study, it has two primary foci. So we've got new and reconstructed water crossings, and we have new and reconstructed roads. Both new construction and reconstruction have the same bar for FPA rule criteria. So we're including them both, which gives us a larger sample size to draw from, because as some of you may imagine, like how many new water crossings over type F streams are there every year? Not a lot. But if you include reconstruction, that does increase your sample size, and we can cast a bit of a wider net there. So for water crossings, the intent is to obtain a comprehensive perspective on the implementation of water crossings through first desktop review of the written plans, and then conducting field surveys to evaluate rule applications for a range of water crossing rules. And then next we have the new reconstructed roads. And the approach there is to review the written plans and understand the frequency that road construction and reconstruction includes and crosses critical locations. So I'll dive into that a little bit in just a second here. But first, for the water crossings. So here are the rules. I have two slides of this. So here's the first bit of rules here that are within the purview and the scope of the roads pilot study. First, we have some that are assessed by a desktop review as they're applicable, of course. So we have the written plans for water crossings. So in those rules that I have listed are listed required elements depending on the type of water crossing. You know, if it's a culvert versus a channel spanning bridge, the written plan requirements are different. So of course, as applicable. And here, the thumbs up would be, are all the elements present? And thumbs down would be, elements are not present. So we're not looking at, the quality of each element within the written plan. Instead, is the written plan complete? Is the question that we're looking at here. And then for actual evaluation of water crossings themselves, I have a set of rules below that can be assessed by either a single measurement or observation in the field. So these ones are super clear cut. So for example, culvert diameter, depending on the culvert, minimum culvert size 18 inches. That's easy to measure, single measurement in the field, super clear criteria, very obvious. So we have the culvert diameter or span of the water crossing, the embedment of a culvert, and then erosion control and replanting, whether that was applied or not. Simple presence, absence. And then next, I have some more rules. And these ones are a little more complex. They have criteria requiring multiple measures or observations. So we are also going to look at these and through the pilot gain a lot of information on how these are implemented and whether they would be worth examining on a full-blown long-term compliance monitoring program. So those relate to generally the implementation of bridges, so channel spanning structures or permanent culverts. I guess another point here is that when I say water crossings, and I'm talking about culverts, bridges, whatever, other channel spanning structures, these are all permanent structures. We're not going to look at temporary water crossings or vacation of temporary water crossings. This is for permanent structures. All right, so that was water crossings, the rules for water crossings. Now we have a rule for roads. And this is to assess the frequency that roads occur in critical locations. So as you all know, road locations are the result of many factors. You can't just build a road anywhere on the landscape. There might be, physical impediments, legal impediments, land ownership, all these things have to go into a decision-making process in where do we put the road, existing roads, all these things go into that decision-making process. So here we're not looking at was the road constructed in the right spot? Was the right decision made? That is not what we're looking at. Instead, what we're looking at is how often these new and reconstructed roads cross critical locations under the assumption that road locations are part of an approved forest practice. So if a road crosses a critical location, okay, that's fine. What we want to look at is how frequently does that occur on the landscape for new and reconstructed roads, and what types of critical locations are most frequently crossed by roads. So that can provide a lot of information on if these critical locations should be targeted for future compliance monitoring. Yep. So then that ends up with a study design. So you've got all these rules, funnel them all together. How do you look at these? How do you, assess these in an unbiased manner? So for water crossings, the approach is to draw a sample of new and reconstructed stream crossings from ferns, stratify that sample to type F or non-type F, so fish-bearing, non-fish-bearing streams. And look at both of those because the requirements are quite different depending on the stream type. And then equally allocate samples to that strata, so that ensures that type F streams will be well represented in the data because they are a pretty good priority. And then reviewing the written plans for these water crossings to ensure that all the required elements that are applicable are completed, and then conducting field surveys at those water crossing locations, taking measurements, photos, collecting data, understanding the implementation of those water crossings relative to the criteria laid out in the FPA rules that I listed. And then we have the roads and critical locations question, which is a desktop exercise entirely. So that's drawing a sample from all new and reconstructed roads and ferns, and then reviewing written plans to understand, okay, we have this, let's say, the stack of notifications, digital stack of notifications of all the roads, and looking through them and saying, okay, 10% of these include critical locations, 20% include critical locations, understanding how frequently that occurs. So, actual field methods on the ground. Simple enough. Once you draw the sample, access the unit, access the water crossing. You can target these water crossings because it's in the written plan. Then conducting field measurements. I should say measurements and observations, but there are a lot of measurements, so we can say measurements and measurements. So measurements on culverts. So for example, length, diameter, height, gradient, bed material, fill material, road drainage, all the common features of culverts that you would expect to look at whether you were designing it or assessing it. And then similar things for bridges. So the span, height, surface material, curbs, fill material, road drainage. All these things are laid out in those FPA rules that I mentioned. And then proximately the stream and the stream bank. So nearby up and downstream immediately, like the channel width, the gradient, the substrate, bank conditions, erosion controls. So an example here of how these measurements work together is, measure the gradient within the culvert. Measure the gradient upstream and downstream of the culvert. Do they match? Are they relatively similar? That will give you an understanding of the implementation of the culvert relative to that FPA criteria. And then photos will accompany these measurements to best understand implementation. All right, that was roads. Now to steep slopes. Hopefully nobody's falling asleep here because this is really exciting stuff. So for steep slopes, we're going to be looking at designated debris flow traversal areas, or DDFTAs. These are areas identified by the slopes model as most likely to deliver debris flows to type F and SSBT, so steelhead streams. FPA rules require trio retention proximate to these debris flow traversal areas. So the general approach is a desktop review for written plan completion, similar to the water crossing one I mentioned earlier, and then field evaluation for tree retention on a random sample of harvest units that have those DDFTAs. So the rules associated with this, steep slopes, pretty straightforward. We have 3 rules. First is written plans for slopes model features. And then the criteria is completion of all applicable requirements. And then we have this first rule, 09051, which is the tree retention requirements for DDFTAs under standard option harvests. So that rule requires 100% tree retention within 25-foot slope distance of the DDFTA. And of course, this exempts yarding corridors. So in the study, we are not looking at yarding corridors. Those are not within the scope of this pilot. And then finally, we have the other tree retention requirement, which is for the minimum option harvests, which is a 50% retention cumulatively within 25-foot slope distance of harvest unit DDFTAs. So look at what is the total length of the DDFTAs in the harvest unit, and then at least or more than 50% of that length must be retained. Once again, yarding corridors are exempted. So for the study design, once again, we're drawing a sample of harvest activities from ferns for harvest types 1 through 3, and then stratifying that by standard or minimum option because the requirements are different, and then reviewing desktop notifications and polygons for presence of DDFTAs, and then targeting those DDFTAs for field surveys and surveying the entire length of them in each harvest unit that is drawn for tree retention. And so on the right, we have an image generated from the slopes model. So you see all these little lines are DDFTAs. So that's how they look, based on the spatial data with the associated lengths. All right, so for the field methods, here is a general diagram of the methodology that we recommended. So first I'll talk about the standard option. So here, on the left, we have down the center, we have the DDFTA, and the center of the DDFTA of the line here is designated either as, the middle of the draw, or if there's a channel present, the edge of the active channel. So from that point, 25-foot slope distance, perpendicular to the DDFTA on either side is where tree retention is required. So boots on the ground, what does this look like? So either access for the standard option, either access the bottom side or the top side, upslope, downslope end of it. And then at regular intervals spatially along the DDFTA, taking those 25-foot slope measurements, and then conducting a visual survey for tree retention. So you see here, we have these little points and then 25 feet spreading to either side there. And so the approach is to, traverse either upslope or downslope throughout this space and do a visual survey with associated measurements to ensure tree retention. For the minimum option, it's a little slightly more complex because we have that 50% retention requirement, and that doesn't need to be contiguous. It can be a cumulative length. So here we show a case where it's not contiguous. Surveyors will go out, and you see we have these stars on the diagram to the right. So those are the start and end points of tree retention based on visual observation. So folks will go out, or walk along the DDFTA, take those regular 25-foot slope measurements, and then visually identify the locations and length along the DDFTA where tree retention was implemented. So this will all be spatial data. So we'll have GPS points for each of those stars. And then using that, you can measure the length of the tree retention. Go ahead here. There's some additional considerations because, well, it's steep slopes and these are debris flow traversal areas. So we certainly anticipate that there will be a number of locations that are inaccessible, boots on the ground. So there are some allowances for the folks conducting the surveys, such as being able to offset sampling points to safe locations. This is a visual survey, 25-foot slope distance. So being able to move those points should allow folks to, one, be safe and also still conduct that visual survey. And then using either tape or rangefinder to conduct those measurements. There might be a lot of debris and down trees, things like that in these flow traversal areas, making it difficult to run a tape through, use a rangefinder. And then for minimum option harvests, there's a couple more considerations we have here. As I mentioned, field staff will be establishing the start and end points of those retention areas. And we'll have spatial data for that. And then using that spatial data, drawing that line of tree retention relative to the DDFTA in the slopes model to calculate the percent retention throughout the entire harvest unit. Seth, hop in here.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question about this is a great description. And this is a great point, especially on these steep slopes. You're gonna likely find that there's not just potential for things that have already slid a little bit, but also I think even more common will be blowdown, right? And so that brings up a question both from a blowdown standpoint as well as just what was growing there. The rule itself doesn't require that that you ensure that there are trees within 25 feet. So many of these steep areas don't have, as your drawing shows here, some of these, so like take that top portion on the right, there might not be any trees within 25 feet.
Yep.
I guess the question would be, are you measuring to the stump from the closest stump to the center of the draw or what have you? To ensure that, just because there's not trees there doesn't mean there wasn't compliance, if you know what I mean.
Oh, certainly. And I believe thanks, Seth, by the way. And I believe the rule states vegetation retention. And I mean, it's not like we're going to look at woody bushes or anything like that. But unlike the riparian pilot study, so the riparian pilot study needed to assess what that distance of retention was because of how the rules were written. But here it's just required that 25-foot slope distance is the retention area. So rather than trying to figure out what was implemented, much simpler, much more straightforward to just measure that 25-foot slope distance, do a visual survey in there. You know, if it's a blowdown or if it's just a bare slope without trees on it, should be quite easy to visually assess that there aren't any fresh stumps there, right? So rather than saying, is this forested, is there trees? The question is, you know, is there evidence of recent harvest? And we know when, you know, when the harvest occurred for each harvest unit. So really it's looking for, was there harvest within that area that was delineated? Based on the rules, it doesn't matter if, you know, the first stump was at 26 feet or 50 feet. That would still be considered compliance within the rules. Does that cover it for you, Seth?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
All right, Ken, hop in.
So looking at your diagram, you've got this 50% on the minimum option, the 50% rule. What if the harvest design is that 50% is all on one side of that DDFTA and the other side was unharvested? You're accomplishing the 50% retention requirement, but you don't have these gaps like your diagram describes.
Yeah, I mean that is a great important question. And that would be based on interpretation of that rule. I don't have that interpretation on hand. Maybe somebody from ODF would be able to answer your question there. But that is certainly something that it will be included in the study design regarding was retention implemented on this side or on the other side, and then
it just seems like it might be a look at a different sampling design if that occurs, because the rule isn't in place for shading or other things. It's just debris recruitment. So where the trees are in that 25-foot requirement isn't as important, I guess, as the way the rule's written is pretty flexible. So that just the observation is just maybe you have two different types of sampling, then you have to make a decision once you are doing your desktop survey, which one you're going to use for that particular parcel.
Yep. Thanks for that point. It's important because that 50% could be reached a number of different ways. As I said, you know, you could have this contiguous, you could have this 50% of the DDFTA. If you had, even if it was a minimum option harvest, if you had multiple DDFTAs, you could get to that 50% different ways. So that's certainly a rule interpretation question and something that another reason that it's important to have this as a pilot. Because things like this come up. And then the question becomes, how is the rule interpreted, and ensuring that data is collected in a way that allows for the appropriate interpretation of the rule. All right. So that's both those studies. So some anticipated outcomes from these pilots. So this, once again, stepping back, high-level view. The purpose here is to establish that Division 678 directed monitoring program for roads, steep slopes, riparian already in progress. So we provided draft pilot study plans that have been reviewed by ODF and then have been returned to us, and we plan to deliver those next month back to ODF, at which point I believe they will be circulated through the group here. And the purpose, once again, is to collect data informing the structure and priorities of the long-term compliance monitoring program, to identify those rules and the right way to look at those rules, and ensuring that the field methods align with that. So identifying those rules and then refining, the efficiency, the statistical reliability of the way that data is collected, for, the main points here being evaluating the written plan, the field methods that are used, and then, of course, accessibility considerations for DDFTAs. How often are areas inaccessible? How often are they inaccessible, but you could still conduct a visual survey and say delineate it with a rangefinder? And how often are they inaccessible and you couldn't conduct your survey, for example? All right, so outcomes specific to each pilot. For roads, it's assessing the implementation of those new and reconstructed water crossings and identifying the priority rules for monitoring, estimating the proportion of new and reconstructed roads that cross critical locations. And then for steep slopes, understanding first the proportion of harvests that include DDFTAs. Through the sample draw process, should be able to get to that. Reviewing how DDFTAs are incorporated in the written plans, evaluating how tree retention is applied in DDFTAs. So particularly for minimum option harvest, how was that retention layout built and applied on the landscape? Well, that's what I have for you all today. I can pass it back to Emily. I believe she has a couple other things, and we'll open it up for discussion. Or
thank you so much, Mark.
No problem.
All right, I'll get back to sharing my slides. Been experiencing some Teams difficulties. Unfortunately, I couldn't see any of your slides. I know you were sharing some, but hopefully that doesn't affect the recording. But just FYI,
well, they're
guys,
beautiful. I put in all sorts of animations and videos and things. You really missed out.
Well, now I'm sad. But anyway, all right, I'll go back to we really only just have one more slide, which is the next steps. So I'll go ahead and share that here. Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, can everyone see my upcoming meeting slide?
Yes.
All right. Okay, great. Thanks. Again, it's been kind of weird today. I've never experienced these things with Teams before, so don't know what's going on. All right, so just looking ahead, we only have one more meeting scheduled out right now. It'll be on October 30th. We'll do another riparian pilot update. By then, we'll be in the field season because we're starting probably more like beginning of October with that. And then just another update on our roads and steep slopes pilot. And then I mentioned at the previous meeting that we are going to be having a compliance monitoring program symposium with some other states coming. We're definitely going to have California, Idaho, and Washington there, possibly Alaska. But we'll probably just do a quick a quick takeaway of what that looked like. I've been working on the getting the field trip all scheduled out, and that's something again we touched on the last meeting. And then we'll take some time to schedule our meetings for 2026 since this is our last meeting of 2025. Any questions about that or anything else we covered today?
I have
Yeah.
a question. When you
Mhm.
mentioned that symposium, is that internal
Yeah.
for agency staff, or are you planning that for public and well for us?
That's more internal, although we'll probably we're thinking about like recording some of the sessions. It's more to just give us some ideas about how we might improve our program or just understand how other agencies with similar programs work. But at some point, we'll probably even, have a discussion about possibly like having someone present from the CMPC within that symposium. We're still getting everything figured out, but I think it would be good. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's what I had assumed. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I think we're still getting everything figured out, but we'll probably be recording those sessions so that we have it for ourselves to look back on, but also in case anyone from CMPC or elsewhere wants to see what occurred. But again, like that's not something we fully decided on yet. So, yeah. Any other questions? Thank you, Seth. All right. Well, we're ending a little early today, but went over a lot of things between MHE's presentation and our notice and our riparian pilot study update. So I guess unless there's any other questions, we can give you back some time today. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Take care.
Thanks, Emily.